Hi everybody, welcome to another version of A-Push Review. We're working off of 25 questions that were created, and number 13 is historians have traditionally labeled the period after the War of 1812 as the era of good feelings. Evaluate the accuracy of this label considering the emergence of nationalism and of sectionalism. Use any documents or knowledge from 1815 to 1825 to construct your answer. So let's do this one right now. We're going to go back in time to period 4. Go to the whiteboard. So we're going to period 4 right now. Period 4 runs from Jefferson's election in the age of Jefferson to 1848 on the heels of the American Civil War. We call these the early national years. This particular question wants to know about the effects of the War of 1812. So the War of 1812 is the context. It's fought from 1812 to 1814. The U.S. versus Britain. We don't get any foreign help, and it's basically not a loss. We didn't lose. We didn't lose the war. It's not a loss. It's not a loss. We didn't really win, but we didn't lose. And doing that alone without the help of Britain, or without the help of France and other foreign countries, made us feel really nationalistic. So the period that they asked for is 1815 to 1825. And nationalism, you can stay here and review, Ava and Heather. Nationalism is a thing. What is nationalism? Nationalism is extreme pride in one's country. We're very prideful. A good way to remember that is the Star Spangled Banner was written by Francis Scott Key during the American Revolution, or during the War of 1812. But we're filled with nationalistic pride because we fought Britain by ourselves. It also is called the era of good feelings because there's only one political party. The Federalists are dead. The Federalists are dead. The Federalists are dead. So, what we're seeing is just who used to be the Democrat Republicans. And this is a trend that will continue until the election of 1824. Because sectionalism, as the question asks about sectionalism, and sectionalism is, oh my, I don't want that. I wanted more colors. Sectionalism is putting your section, that's north, south, or west, ahead of USA. Putting the section ahead of USA. And so that's the downside. So that prompt asks you something. They say, hey, is the era of good feelings, is it really like a good feeling time? In some ways. But in other ways, sectionalism is the roots of that are tearing us apart. And we all know, what is sectionalism going to lead to long after this? Civil War. So this is the seeds of sectionalism. So, hey, the good news is we're not two parties fighting. The bad news is each of the sections has their own candidates in the 1824 election, and it ends up the candidate that transcended all of it gets screwed over, and the northern candidate wins because he has a corrupt bargain with the western candidate. And so this is the beginning of the South feeling left out. This election of John Quincy Adams in 1824 is sort of the end of the era of good feelings, because one thing that happens after it is we split into two parties again, the Whigs and the Democrats. The Democrats will be the party of Jackson. The Whigs will be the National Republicans that Quincy Adams was. And that, the era of good feelings is officially over because people aren't feeling good from that. They're also not feeling good because there's a financial panic in 1819. And this is a good time to remind you about the American economy. So the American economy has ups and downs. 1819, 1837, 1857, 1873, 1893, 1929. We could keep going with that. We could talk about 1991. We could talk about 1981, 1991. We could keep going and talk about COVID in 2020, 2007. But the Panic of 1819 also contributes to it not being a good feeling time. And that's problems with the bank and other issues, financial problems. So let's move this on down. Let's talk about some things that happened in that time frame that we had mentioned. So part of the nationalism was used by Henry Clay. Henry Clay in Congress gave us the American system. So let's remember what that is. The American system was improved roads and bridges, the American system was
13. Wait, cost. This
Yeah.
is still question 13.
Still
Okay.
13. I'm just really like deep diving here. The American system was improved roads and bridges. The American system was, I'll let you write that down. Tariffs and the national bank returns. This is supposed to help America as a whole, although I don't know how much it really helps the South. I don't think it helps the South that much. This is also the era of the Monroe Doctrine. The Missouri Compromise. And the beginning of the Transportation Revolution, just to mention that. And even the Market Revolution. So a lot happens in that window. Imagine that. You look at this little 10-year space that the question is 1815 to 1825, and there's this significant presidential election. There's Henry Clay's American system. There's the Missouri Compromise, the Monroe Doctrine, and the beginning of the Transportation and Market Revolutions. Pretty significant for just a 10-year window in American history in these early national years. Any questions about this? Okay, let's do, I want to do two more. Let's do question.
Can we do one?
Ooh, you want to do one? Want to do one?
Yeah.
One is really simple, so yeah, we can do one. That's almost why I didn't do it.
Oh.
So we'll do one.
Does it matter what order? Like the questions?
No, I don't care. As long as you number them.
Yeah, that's what I'm doing.
Okay, one. It says analyze the origins and development of slavery in Britain's North American colonies. And they want you to keep it from 1607, Jamestown, to 1776, the American Revolution and the Declaration of Independence. So what they want you to do is origins and development. Now, context. Slaves were here even before the African slave trade, right? They tried to enslave the natives, the Spanish did with the encomienda system before these dates. So if you're writing an essay and you need context points, you know, it's not like slavery is a brand new concept. But for sake of this course, the key date is 1619. This is the date. I don't have you memorize a lot of years, but that's the name of the project about slavery. That's a very stinging year because it's the first year of the African slave trade. And why did they come here? Because indentured servitude wasn't working, and African labor to the people, particularly on the tobacco plantations, and it becomes that, tobacco plantations, African labor for them is the cheapest and easiest. So, what you see is, I'm going to draw, this is going to be awful. This is Africa. This is Europe. Okay? This is the United States. And then the little islands in the Caribbean. This is a world map. This is the Atlantic Ocean. Getting this visual is important because what we see happen from 1619 to 1776 is a lot of triangular trade. So we see three-way trades. In different directions, where slaves came from Africa on the Middle Passage, which was a horrible journey, and they came to these islands in the Caribbean, and then they either stayed there or things from the island shipped here, or they shipped directly to the tobacco plantations and throughout the 13 English colonies. And so, what does this mean? What does this mean if this is the origin of this? What essentially, how does this develop? Well, slaves are going to be in all 13 colonies eventually. Of course, they're more prevalent in the South because the plantations are conducive for it. Is it just tobacco? No. Rice, indigo. Did they work on large farms? Were there slaves around here? Yes. Up here in New York, there were slaves. There were slaves everywhere during colonial America. By the American Revolution, which is the reason they picked 1776, okay, by that date, there were 2.5 million Americans, and 500,000 of them were slaves. That's 20%. And in places like South Carolina and Virginia, there were more slaves than there were whites. And that should give you some perspective of like how crazy this is. This slavery system that is like the backbone of the Southern economy at this point. Any questions? Is that good for number one?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, turn to the back. I'm going to do 25 because I think it's an easy one to pick and we can do it pretty easy. Let's do 25. 25 is the end of period 7. It is the end of, it's the last part. It's like 7.14 or 7.13 in terms of the learning target. And they want to know the home front experiences of these different groups, these 4 ethnic groups. These are American citizens. So let's break them down. So first of all, World War II. The U.S. is involved from Pearl Harbor to 1945, December 7th, 41 to 45. For African Americans, they fought in segregated units. They fought in segregated units. That means they fought only with other African Americans. Large numbers of African Americans fought. 500,000, and they fought in segregated units. They fought bravely. They believed very strongly in the cause. They believed in what was called the WW2 campaign, which was victory against the fascists and Hitler abroad, and simultaneously victory for civil rights at home. And they believed that if they did this, they'd get this. Were they right? Well, there are some roots of the civil rights movement that you could say. I mean, remember, Jackie Robinson breaks the color barrier just 2 years after the war. Does that make sense? But I would write down the double V campaign because they really wanted victory against racism at home and victory against the fascists abroad. Mexican Americans. This is the Zoot Suit riots. There's an interesting thing that happens here. So, there's riots in LA because so many Mexican Americans flood into LA and the Mexican population spikes that they riot with the white people. They're called the Zoot Suit riots in 1943.
How do you spell
Zoot suit is like, it's just the type of suit that people wore then that the whites must have been wearing and fighting in the street with. Why are the Mexicans coming here in large numbers?
For jobs?
Jobs. They're crossing the border because they're being asked to fill industry jobs. I know that's ironic now because now there's a big stink that they're crossing the borders, period, by some people in this country. But we were asking them to come because we needed industry jobs filled. So they were flooding in the Southwest, being asked to come here for jobs, and they become a significant contributor to the American workforce, Mexican Americans. Next one. American Indians. Oh, that's not even on here. So Jewish Americans' contributions. I'm surprised American Indians isn't on here because obviously they contributed, but let's do what's on here. Jewish Americans, really important here. First of all, for Jewish Americans, this war is very personal. Think about who they're fighting against and what's happening to Jewish people throughout Eastern Europe and in Germany. And it's even worse than they realize. A lot of Jewish Americans escaped East Germany, especially like scientists and doctors. And they came here and they worked on the Manhattan Project. And they contributed to the Manhattan Project. So for Jewish Americans during World War II, they came here and they used their knowledge to contribute to American science. They also fought bravely in the American military, as did Mexican Americans. The one group that really got harshly treated, and we mentioned it in class today with the Korematsu case, were the Japanese Americans. On the West Coast, where most Japanese American citizens lived, President Roosevelt rounded up the men and put them into internment camps. I don't know, it was like college dorms. Feels a lot like jail. Why did they do this? They didn't commit a crime. Because FDR felt like they were a threat. We were fighting a war against the Japanese in the Pacific, and they weren't being trusted. So they put them in internment camps. One of them went to the Supreme Court, and in the case of Korematsu versus the U.S., Korematsu doesn't win. The U.S. wins. Korematsu's told that his First Amendment rights are not as significant during wartime, much like the Schenck decision during World War I with clear and present danger. 40-something years later, we pay reparations, $75,000 to every Japanese American that was living or to their family that was a part of this sham because we're so embarrassed by this. So that's the Japanese American contribution.
How many years later was it?
What?
How many years later?
About 40-something years later in the 1980s. We paid $75,000 for reparation. And that's our lesson for today. Just if you're keeping track at home, we did number 1. Well, first we did number 13, number 1, and then number 25. Thanks, folks.